Now let's go to Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consultants and a former strategic analyst at CSIS, and Andrew House, who is counsel and co-lead for the National Security Group at Fasken Law. And Andrew worked on the anti-terrorism file for the Federal Attorney General in 2006 when the Toronto 18 were arrested. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Libby.
Hi, Libby. Thanks for having us.
Okay, let us begin with Andrew House. You know this file intimately. What's your reaction to this?
Well, look, I think it's fair to first of all acknowledge the parole board doesn't have an easy time of it, but at the same time, putting public safety first has not always been a characteristic of the decisions of the board, and this has created a real tension through the years. It's an independent institution of the federal government, which means no minister of the Crown, no prime minister can tell them what decision to make. They can make appointments to that board, and then you hope that the people who serve on that board serve with public safety at the top of their list. There are other values, rehabilitation, a redemptive track to someone's life, but you hope that first and foremost is the idea that people who have offended cannot be permitted to offend again. And this is always the challenge in the decisions of those charged with being parole board members.
Well, shouldn't those two things not be mutually exclusive? If somebody is on track to rehabilitation, then public safety is not at risk. I mean, are you dismayed by this decision, Andrew?
So let's acknowledge that 14 years is a long time. It should be enough time for someone to change their ways. But, I've seen over and over again examples, unfortunately, where the possibility of rehabilitation doesn't mean the probability or the certainty of it. And this is what makes these decisions so critical and so difficult. I am really bothered by the fact that the Correctional Service of Canada, which these are the people, these are the correctional officers and supervisors and personnel who have the best opportunity to observe the inmate day to day, hour by hour, that they were opposed to this. I really would like to know more about why they were opposed. I think the public has a right to hear these details, and I just don't feel like we've heard enough. Why was the Correctional Service opposed? And in the face of that, why did the parole board override that wish and grant what is day parole? This is not full parole, but still it puts the person in circulation, and that is a problem.
Phil, what do you make of it?
Well, I really like Andrew's comments, Libby. And just for your listeners' context, I was actually at CSIS when the Toronto 18 started way back in the summer of 2005, all the way up to the arrest in 2006. I've interviewed several of them in a prison setting. I've written 6 books on terrorism in Canada, around the world. And I think what worries me is exactly what Andrew said. The people that are responsible for making what are really tough decisions, and I want to recognize that you're making a judgment call on someone's releasability, rate of recidivism into society, and that can't be an easy thing to make. The professionals are saying he's not ready, and yet someone overrides that. That worries me as someone, Libby, who had worked on Islamist extremism for 15 years at CSIS. I understand the mindset. I understand why these guys are going to do what they want to do. And yet we've got a guy who was part of a plot to detonate 3 one-ton fertilizer bombs in the heart of Toronto and probably in Trenton, the air base where was sort of the taking off and landing part for the Afghan mission for the better part of the 2000s and 2010s. This guy is now going to have some degree of freedom, and I don't think Canadians are comfortable with that. I'm certainly not. There's nothing that I've seen, Libby, to suggest that this individual, despite his remonstrations to the contrary, thinks differently today than he thought back in 2005, 2006. And that, to me, is the bottom line.
Did you ever interview people who talked about him? I'm assuming you haven't interviewed him himself.
Not Abdelhaleem in particular, though I did interview 4 other members of the Toronto 18 plot and walked away with varying degrees of comfort in terms of, had they seen the error of their ways kind of thing. The bottom line for me, though, is that, is 14 years enough in prison for an individual who wanted to kill and maim hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadians? And I think the answer is no. And let me turn the question on its head. Would Canadians be okay if Paul Bernardo got out tomorrow? Or Mark Lapine, who slaughtered 14 women back in 1989, in his anti-feminist crusade? Would be okay with that? To the best of my knowledge, only 2 members of the Toronto 18 are still serving their sentences, the 2 leaders, and the rest are either completely out or are on, as Mr. House suggests, some kind of a day parole restriction. I don't know that I'm okay with that. I don't think most Canadians are okay with that.
Well, it's interesting. I read through a report on what he told the parole board in a 3-hour meeting, and he seemed to, it sounded like a very sophisticated individual who knew exactly what to say. He was, even inventing words. I mean, apparently this is a quote. "I know that you're taking a risk and this is going to be highly mediatized." That's a great new word. But obviously, this guy knew exactly what to say, and he apparently was a very well-off professional software engineer when all of this happened. And he said, I thought my life was useless, and I embraced this, and boy, I was so wrong. It just sounds like, here's a guy who knows exactly what to say. I don't know him. I can't see into his heart, but is that a wrong conclusion from all of this?
No, it's not. Abdelhaleem was an interesting exception to what was an erroneous assumption by many people that only people who are down and out, marginalized, not well educated, economically, not well off, are the ones that embrace Islamist extremism or terrorism. He was a guy with a 6-figure salary. I believe he drove a BMW. He was a very successful man who happened to have a father who also shared his views, by the way, a religious scholar. And I think you may have a point there, Libby. I think maybe he's saying what people want to hear to convince them that, he's seen the light of day and no longer poses a threat to society. Does he? I don't know. I don't know that Abdelhaleem still thinks exactly the same way he does back in 2005. But my argument here is that I'm not sure that, a life sentence should be mitigated to 14 years. I don't know that that's the right way of looking at things. Andrew may disagree with me. He's got a different experience than I do. I just don't know what it takes for an individual to actually renounce in his heart of hearts and his mind of minds the very ideology that led him to act in the first place. I don't know what guarantee we need as a society that keeps us safe and provides some kind of a surety that, in fact, he may not reoffend or, re-engage in similar activity down the line.
I don't know what evidence there is about all of these de-radicalization programs. I don't think that their success rate is that high. Andrew House?
So people have really struggled with the whole counter-radicalization agenda. Many people claim to do it. I'm not certain that many people do it well. I don't even think there's an accepted body of literature on how to do it. And what you see in the Canadian prison system are people who are coming to their statutory release date, who are being released into society, who are still radicalized. You see evidence of this famously, the case of Carlos Larmond, who released in 2019 when he was still deemed a high risk to public safety. He had not changed his ways, he had not changed his views. Remind us
of that case, please.
So Mr. Larmond was someone who wanted to travel to join ISIS, which became an offense in the latter stages of the Conservative government. It was an offense to make an attempt to travel to join and support ISIS, the act of traveling. And this is what he was convicted of, and he served time, but was released in 2019, even though prison officials knew that he had not expressed remorse for what he had attempted to do. That really is, I think, at the heart of the problem is how do we deal with people in the prison system who are not being rehabilitated, and what's worse, an environment where people tend to radicalize even more if that is their predisposition. They meet like-minded people in the prison system. Now that's a critique from the left and the right about prisons. It is the best system we have at present. But the struggle for multiple governments has been, how do we do better at making sure that people get access to the right programs in the prison environment, or at least are separated from others who are going to further radicalize them. And by the way, it's not just about their mental state, it's about their knowledge, it's about their capability. And as Phil will tell you, when someone is radicalizing to violence, the way that CSIS looks at this is not only their desire, but their capability. And when desire and capability intersect, this is where you have a dangerous situation. And one of the goals of the Toronto 18 was to storm Parliament, which in fact was a scenario that played out horribly in 2014. So this is where this becomes really ominous. If this had played out back in 2006, it would have been our 9/11. And thank goodness it was stopped. And I can remember one of my first jobs in government was tracking this file as it progressed its way after the arrests, and just seeing the incredible coordination of our intelligence service and law enforcement across Canada, and the litany of people involved in stopping this. Thank goodness they were there, and people like Phil were at the front line to make sure it did not happen.
Okay. I'm going to give the numbers out again because we do have a few minutes left. And I think Phil brought up a very good question. Should a life sentence mean 14 years for somebody who was going to do something so heinous? Let's take a call from Pat. Hi, Pat.
Good afternoon. I just looked at the information on the parole board, and the interesting aspect is that the per diem pay is between $655 and $770 a day. I'd be very curious to know whether these go to members of the political party in power at the time. My suspicion is it does. But there's some very interesting information on here, and this is just on the internet, Government Canada, a day in the life of a parole board member. But I just look at this and say, it'd be very interesting to know what the criteria that are used to appoint members to the board.
Okay, that's a good question, Pat. Thanks. It depends, I guess, when they were appointed. I mean, I think generally speaking, whatever government is in power appoints their friends to these kind of cushy appointments, not necessarily with professional qualifications. Do either of you want to comment on that?
I will quickly. One thing we did at CSIS when I was there, Libby, was to actually brief parole board members on a regular basis on things like radicalization and terrorism, so they had a better understanding of what this thing was about. And very quickly on deradicalization, your listeners may be interested. I'm actually hosting a webinar next week at the University of Ottawa on a new book on which I was a co-author on deradicalization. And I'm not surprisingly rather skeptical for the reasons Andrew mentioned. It's not well understood. There's a program a minute around the world. There's no effective way to measure whether deradicalization works. And so it's a great idea in principle, but does it actually achieve what you want it to do? There's more questions than answers at this point.
Yeah, and again, it can be very hard to tell who's sincere and who's not sincere, who spins a good tale and who doesn't.
Exactly.
So I just want to, before we wrap up, get back to the question of overriding a recommendation from Corrections Canada. I mean, what would possess them to do that, Andrew? I mean, you said you'd like more information about that, but I just need more on that.
So sometimes this comes down to weighing the credibility of the individual in the room, and this is why we have a legal system where the trier of fact gets to look at someone, the judge gets to eyeball someone and figure out if they're being sincere or not. Now the problem is, and there is literature on this, humans aren't very good at weighing the honesty of other humans, and the parole board, they're humans as well.
And so you know what? Sorry to interrupt, but this, please, I think, was a virtual hearing, so you didn't even have the person in front of you.
Well, I mean, this has been a problem recently, including access for the press and victims because of COVID-19. These are legitimate concerns. The parole board, I'm sure, is doing their level best, but it does make it more difficult anytime you add on a complexity like that. I wouldn't mind going back to something that Pat just mentioned, if it's okay.
Sure.
It is interesting. The appointment is done by the federal cabinet. The common perception would be that you do appoint your friends. I'd actually make the contrary argument when it comes to the parole board. Appointing your political friends to an independent body where you can't discipline them in any way. You can't tell them they've made a bad call. You're not allowed to do that. That is highly problematic. And so I think governments have tried to do a better job of picking people who are actually qualified. There's an exam involved, and it's a tough exam, by the way. The problem is, once someone has been appointed, they do bear the mark of that political stripe of government. They go forward, they make these decisions in an independent fashion, and sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes public safety is not the paramount value. You sit there and listen to someone for 3 hours. They're convincing. They've been in for a long time. And I think there is sort of a grinding down or a desire to try to see the best in people. That's very laudable. It's just not always the right call. And luckily, in the case of this individual, a life sentence, that means that he will always in some way be under the jurisdiction of the parole board and of the system. And if he steps out of line, reaches those conditions, there is the possibility of simply bringing him back in. And that is one safeguard, probably the best safeguard in this situation.
Unless they lose track of him. Anyway, let's hope that it works out well. But thank you so much for your insight on this really interesting conversation. Thank you, Andrew House and Phil Gurski. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, Andrew.
You're listening to an exclusive podcast of Fight Back on Zoomer Radio. Heard weekdays from noon to 1.